In this bonus demo, we will see how to create a Flex component with the Adobe Flex Builder. And then we will have a look at how to make this component available to Flash Island. And finally, we will see how to integrate this Flash Island component into Dynpro for ABAP. When we look at our current application, that's the one that we used in the portal eventing demonstration. Then the first component was to display the flight list. And what we want to achieve is that in this first component, there's another button available which allows me to display a graphical overview of the current booking situation on all my flights. So when I hit this button, you see the Flash Island opens and it shows me for each flight date and time the number of seats available and the number of booked seats. So this is our program. The software that we're going to use here is the Adobe Flex Builder. I'm using version 3. It doesn't really matter whether you use version 2, 3, or 3.2, or 4, 4.2. For all these versions, SAP provides the necessary libraries. So we will start creating a new project here. File, new Flex project. And what we want to display is the flight overview. We call our project Flight Graphics. Make sure that the application type remains as web application runs in Flash Player. And remember the path where you're going to store this project, because later we need to get access to the Flight Graphics Swift file and import it as a MIME object into the Dynpro. Then we hit the next button. The output folder is the bin debug. Leave it. And the library we need to add, we will get from the SAP system. What we need to supply here is the SAP Flash Islands component. This SAP supplied library does most of the work to perform the data transformations between ABAP Dynpro and the Flex. And it provides also the functions for eventing. The necessary library is stored on the ABAP system here in the MIME repository. So we go to transaction SE80, hit the MIME repository button, and then it's in the public BC UR NW7 Flash Islands folder. There are multiple files in this folder. The impl.swift files are linked at runtime to the compiled Flex components. These contain the majority of the island's functionality. By linking at runtime, we reduce the size of the Flex component so we can save bandwidth. But it also makes it easier for SAP to patch the library by delivering a new version in the MIME repository via support packages. You then get fixes and new functionality without having to recompile your Flex component. The library that we are interested in for adding to our Flex component project is the WD Islands library 30. The files without a numeric suffix are the Flex 2 versions. The ones with 30 suffix are for Flex 3. The ones with 40 suffix are for Flex 4. There are also debug versions for each library. For our purposes, we will use this 3.0 version of the non-debug library. If you want to use a different version, you need just to change the project settings so it compiles on a different release level. Right mouse click on the Flash Islands library and download it. Now returning to the Flex Builder, we are still in the Flex Project Wizard. On the Library tab, we add the library now. that we downloaded from the ABAP MIME repository in the previous step, and then click the Finish button. Now we will have the empty shell of a Flex component with a design button, that's the preview, and the source button. If we want to use a different library version, then we go to the project settings, and on the properties we click on the Flex compiler, and then you can here decide to use an older version or a newer version. Now let's talk about coding our Flex component. We will walk through each section of the coding to explain what is it doing. Although this isn't intended to be a general tutorial on Flex development, therefore you should check the Adobe website for these tutorials. A little explanation is in order. Flex development is a mixture of mXML tags and ActionScript. mXML tags allow you to define the layout of the UI elements on the screen. ActionScript is the scripting language of Flex components. This is where you place your event handlers, do dynamic manipulation of the UI and other such coding blocks. For our Flash Island component, we will use a mixture of mXML and ActionScript. We will start by altering some of the properties of the MX application tag. We will change the layout to vertical and set the background color and background gradient alpha's value that matches up to the background settings in Dynpro. We will also set the width and height to 100%. This allows the Flash Island component to fill the entire container set aside for it on the screen by Dynpro. We will control the actual size of the component later when we create the definition of the island within Dynpro. Finally, we come to the most important change to the MX application tag for the usage of the islands framework. We need to set an ActionScript function to be fired upon initialization. That's the initialize property of the component. It is the coding within this function that will register this component with the Flash Islands framework. Because you don't want to watch me type, I copy and paste these coding sections. I've already prepared it. We change the layout. We adapt the size so that it fills the Dynpro container that's prepared. We define the function that's used for initialization. The function doesn't exist yet, so when we save, we will get an error message. And we adapt the background color so that it fits more to the Dynpro background color. The next is we have to do the scripting block for the component. In this scripting block, we will define 3 different sections. In the first section, we have the import statements. So this is the scripting block. In the first section, we have our import statements. These declare the libraries we want to use in our application. Notice the import of sap.flashislands. This gives us access to the functions that are exposed by the WD Islands library 30.swc that we added to our project earlier. Next, we have the variables section. Data binding between the island and the surrounding Dynpro application is really quite easy. Any public variables or public getSet methods are immediately exposed to the island framework. The SAP provided Flash Island library will do all the translation between the data types. From the Flex developer's standpoint, we only need to make these variables public. So for our chart, we want to get the data from Dynpro. In Dynpro for ABAP, the data is usually an internal table bound to a context node with cardinality 0 many. The corresponding object of such a data object in Flex is an array collection. However, array collections do not work quite exactly like ABAP internal tables in that their columns are not statically typed at design time. Therefore, it will adapt to whatever columns are passed through from Dynpro. So when we look at the three public variables that I defined here, each with the keyword bindable, this is for my axis, and for the two bars for seats max economy and seats occupied economy. So when we look back to the portal eventing Dynpro, we have seats max economy and seats occupied economy. And these two columns I want to display as bars. So all these three variables I have to define as bindable. However, we won't want to tie our flex code to the column names that are used in ABAP. Therefore, we can declare alias fields to point to the actual column names. You see, I'm calling it axis and not flight date. I'm calling it seats max eco and not seats max. So the variable names do not need to match the Dynpro names. Later, when we do the name mapping in Dynpro, you will see how we specify what Dynpro context attribute name will get filled into these alias variables. This makes it possible to rename objects in Dynpro without breaking the connected flex coding, and vice versa. Finally, the maxfill and ocfill variables really don't have anything to do with the islands interface. These are local variables to define the colors I want to use in my bar chart. In the final script section is the init_app function. Remember, this is the function that will be called when the component is initialized. In this function, we only need to call the register function of the SAP supplied Flash Island library. This registers the entire component with the Flash Islands framework. In the final code block, which I will add now, we put in the remaining mXML tags to define the animations of our chart, the bar chart itself with its inner axis and series definitions, as well as the legend. The Flex component is now complete. We can view the preview of what the final component will look like in the design view. So first let's save it, and then let's look in the design view. Now if you want to use a debug build of the component, then you also need the debug libraries. However, I'm pretty sure that this application is going to work fine the first time without needing any debugging. So we will produce a final build. For this, choose Project Export Release Build. This will create a new folder within our project workspace called bin release with a compiled runtime version of our component named Flight Graphics Swift. Remember this location, as we will need to upload this file later into our Dynpro application. Now we are done with the Flex Builder. We can close this and concentrate on the Dynpro tasks. This is the Dynpro component we want to extend. The plan is to display the Flash Island component underneath our existing flight table. We cannot add an element directly to the layout here because the Flash Island element has to be the root element of a view. And our root element is a root UI element container that cannot hold a Flash. So what we have to provide is a separate view for the Flash Island that's then later going to embed it here in the view UI element container. So we add a new element. View container UI element, that's for our Flash graphics. and put it to the left side. And we want to be able to trigger the visibility of this flash graphics. You see here in my application, I have this button and a table toolbar. Initially, the flash is not visible. So we need a context attribute first. I'm providing a node, flash settings, with one attribute so far. Type of this attribute is WDY Boolean. The default value is going to be false. In my layout, I will bind the flash graphics visible property to the new attribute. And in my second group, I will add a toolbar. This toolbar, I will add a toolbar button. And the toolbar button needs an action that writes the value up true into the new visible context attribute. The necessary coding is generated with the Dynpro code wizard. We set this attribute. The value for this attribute is set here. I make it up true. In the next step now, we have to provide the view that displays the flash island. Create a new view and call it flash view. And remember, I said the flash island has to be the root element of a view. We couldn't embed it into the main view because there the root element was a root UI element container. But in this view, we don't need the root UI element container. So we can right click it and swap the root element definition and make it a flash island. Yeah, you see the icon has changed now. What else is necessary? The data that we're going to display has to come from the context. Right now we don't have a context. So what we need to do is to map our flights node. There's the data flight date for the axis and seats max and seats awk. Back in the layout, we have to add the necessary elements to display the bars. We also have to add the Swift file. To add the Swift file, in the Swift file property, we have to add it to our Dynpro component as a MIME object. Right-click your component, create, MIME object, import. Navigate to your Swift file and add it to your component. The Swift file you need to enter here also as a property. Now we need to map our context node flight to the flex component data source named data source. So let's have a quick look back into our flex component. And there's our first variable that needs to be mapped, data source. And then the additional variables axis, seats max echo, and seats awk echo. We right click on our Flash Island component and insert data source. Now we do the mapping to the flights table and give it the name data source. That's the way how we bind the context variables to the flex variables. Just like we map the name of the context node now to the flex data source, we must also map the names of the context attributes to the flex property names. So we right mouse click on this new data source and insert property. The value property needs a binding, and this first one is going to be our axis, and the axis is bound to the FL date. And we always make sure that we match the names that we have here, axis. And the next one is going to be seats max eco. New property. Seats max. And one last time. Seats org eco and bound to seats org. Now we embed the Flash Islands view within the window view container. We open the window. This is the main views container, and we right click it and embed the new Flash view. Now before we test this, we have to quickly go back to our main view and do some small changes. Our button doesn't have a caption yet. Display graphics. Plus the Flash Island component itself doesn't have a proper sizing. So when we click over here, we should give height and width. We make this 500 px and this 1200 px, and then we activate whatever needs to be activated. And now we're ready for the last test. This was the application. This is what it should look like when it's done. So we refresh our application. There's the new button. Now we go again for our American Airlines Flight 17. Display all flights. Hit the new button. Here we have our graphic display. Flight date as axis value. The gray bars is the max number of seats, and the yellow bars is the occupied number of seats.